Okay, so what we're going to work on this time is a little bit of authentication for the pages. So just nice and simple, if we're logged into a page, we want to be able to access these, but if we're not logged in, we don't want to access them. Same as these two, we only want to access them if we're not logged in. And yeah, we will add another feature in that called strict, which I'll explain as we get to it. So first thing we want to do is, this is going to sit inside of our page config. So we want to add some more data into those. So let's call it authentication. All right, from our authentication, we want to have authenticated. So authentication is going to hold all of our authentications for the future, but for right now we're just going to look at authenticated. So it's just going to check to see whether you have to be authenticated to access the page. And we're going to have two things in there. One is called auth, and it's going to be a boolean, and that's going to say whether you need to be authenticated to access the page, true or false. Then we're going to have a strict, which is also going to be a boolean, true or false, to say whether this rule has to be enforced strictly. The reason why we want to do that is, just for example, the home page. We want to be able to access that whether you're authenticated or you're not authenticated. So our auth would be false. Okay, but we want to say if we're not authenticated, we still want to access it. Just reiterating myself there for some stupid reason. Okay, but register and login, we want to say we want auth to be false because we want to make sure that you're not authenticated when you're using these two. And we want the strict to be true, which means you have to be not authenticated to access these two. So essentially, home you can use when you're logged in or logged out. Register, you have to be logged out, and you have to strictly be logged out to access. And that's pretty much it. So for now, we're going to save that. And now we need to update all of our page configs. So if we look, that's all we have in our page configs. We want to update them to have those extra records. So let's come back up here. We're going to copy you. Probably won't need it for now, but all right. Let's create another anonymous function, async. There we go. Now we want to pull in const page config is equal to require you, and you. All right, so what we want to do first is we want to download all of these records from the database. So we're going to say const data is equal to await page config.find, and we want to download everything. Let's just make sure that we have that. Console log our data, go, and that should give us over here. There we go, all of them. All right, so now we want to loop through every single one. So data for each page. Okay, so we want to loop through each page. Okay, so when we're looking at each one, we want to find and update that record. So we're going to say await page config dot find one and update, and we want to find that record by the ID, which is going to be stored in page ID. Okay, so every time we find one, we want to set a new parameter, and that's where this comes in. And for now, we want to just throw something in here. So most of our pages, let's just set our auth to null for now and strict to true. Okay, so we run that, and we've got an error. Why do we have an error? ID is page._ID. Await is only available. Okay, await is only available in asynchronous function. Async go. And that should be good. Let's check out our database. We'll refresh you. Cool. Authentication, authenticated, null, and true. That is exactly what we wanted. All right. Let's get rid of that because we don't need it anymore. So that has updated all of our records. Now we can go through these records and set them as we want. So our home page, we want your authentication to be false because we don't care whether you're logged in or logged out. We want the strict to be false as well because, as I said, we don't care whether you're logged in or logged out. Our register page. So our auth, we want that one set to false because we want to make sure you're logged out. We want the strict to set to true, meaning you have to be logged out. And we want the same for login. Boolean, false, and strict set to true. Cool. Dashboard, we want auth set to true because we want you to be logged in when you access that one. Boolean, change you to true. And log out, we don't want to be able to log out if you haven't been logged in. So that one definitely has to be set to true. General rule is strict should be true on everything except for the odd case being like these two, but we might have more, we might not. We'll deal with those cases as we come. All right, cool. So that is done. Now we need to actually set where we are using that. So what we're going to do is, for now, we only have that one authentication check to see whether you need to be authenticated or not. But we're going to have pretty much a hub set up for where all the authentication is going to sit. And to access that hub, it's going to be from our page config. So up here, let's say authentication, and let's bring that in. Const authentication check is equal to require. Let's create that. So we're going to say authentication check. I'm going to say authentication check. Now we're going to come down to here. So we're going to say if authentication check is false, then we want to, let's just throw something in there, just placeholder for now. Return to error page. We can deal with that later. Actually, might as well deal with that now. What I was actually thinking was we might combine these two together. So what we're going to do is up here, we're going to go const. We know this is going to want to change. We're going to make that a let. Okay, let response options is equal to an object page config name is an error. Okay. I'm going to say messages error is equal to null because there is no errors. Okay, so let's do this. Let's say if there's no config, we want to say response options dot messages dot error is equal to page not found. And then down here we're going to say if, just literally move that up, can't we? If there's no authentication, if authentication check came back false, we can say response options dot messages dot error is equal to you do not have permission to access this page. All right, then we can have another check to say if there's anything in this messages error, then we want to go to that error page. So we can say if response options dot messages dot error. So if there's something in there, we're going to say response dot render that error page with those response options. Cool. So essentially what we're doing as before is we're saying we've got our response options, which is pretty much our stuff for our response, and we're saying if there's no config page, add that to the errors. If the authentication check fails, add that to the errors. Then we're saying if there is an error, that's when we want to go to the page. That actually makes that look a lot cleaner, a lot nicer. All right, so now let's go to our authentication check. Authentication check. Authentication check is equal to that. Then we want to export that. Module.exports. No, we don't want to export that because we are not exporting it. We're going to return a true or false value. Okay, so we need to pass something through to this. Okay, so we need to pass through our, let's move this along to there. Okay, so the two things we want to pass along is, the first one is the page config. So we'll have config, and the next thing we want to pass along to it is the user. So we want to say request.user or null, meaning there's no user. So if there's a user, we're going to send that. If we're not, we're going to go null. Okay, so for now, let's just boilerplate this, and we're going to return true. So no matter what, it's going to pass. So let's just test one of these pages. Home. Oh, we have a fail. Why do we have a fail? Authentication check is not a function. Okay, why is that not a function? Okay, so it looks like we do need that exports. Module exports is equal to authentication check. Alright, cool. Let's try that one more time. We'll go to home. We go to home. Okay, so we can go to all of those. Now let's check to make sure that it's pulling through our stuff. So here, first thing we're pulling through is that page config, and second one is the user. So let's just console log those. Console.log page config. Cool. Now if we refresh this, we have that page config right there. So that's definitely coming through, just what we want. Now let's check our user, and we are not logged in, so this should actually come back as null right there. So let's log in and make sure this works. Basic at user.com, basic, go. And there we go, we're getting our user. Now that we're logged in, we go back to home, and we're getting that user because we're logged in, go log out, and now we're getting null because we're logged out. That is exactly what we want. Okay, so now we're going to start creating all of our checks. So the first check that we want to create, or the only check for this video, is the authentication check to see whether the page actually needs authentication to access it. So let's first create another one, and we're going to just call this one check authentication. Cool. Now let's pull that one into here. And we're just going to call this one authentication modules. Now let's add that. Const check authentication to require. That's it. Check authentication. Okay, so now we can run that. So we can say let response. So this is what it's going to send back to our page config. And let's just set it as true, because for right now it's true. You can access the page. Okay, so now we want to say if check authentication comes back false, response is equal to false. Why? That on the outside. There we are. Okay. So if the check authentication comes back false, response is false, and we want to return back that response. So for right now, that's not going to work because this isn't going to pull in anything. If we refresh our page, it's going to error. Yep, because check authentication doesn't do anything. So let's come into this check authentication. Actually, we will need to pass through these two into it. Page config and data. All right. Check authentication. Check authentication is equal to, we're pulling in the page config and the user. Then we want to export check authentication module.exports is equal to that check authentication. Okay. So now we can actually do that authentication check. So what we can do is, if we look at here, let's just say we're accessing a page, this one right here. So we want to pretty much say if page config.authentication by .authenticated.auth is equal to true, then this. If false, then do that. Okay, so let's do that. Let's start off with if it needs to be false. So we'll say if page config dot authentication dot authenticated dot auth. Okay, so if that's equal to false. Actually, let's do the same as last time. We're going to do let response is equal to true, saying that right now you're able to access the page. All right. So if we're saying that the authentication required for the page is false, first we want to check if strict is set to true or not. Okay, so we want to say if let's just set it to false. So we'll say dot strict. Okay, so we're saying if you don't have to be authenticated and authentication is strict, is set to false, we want to, well, actually we don't want to do anything because it's already set to true. Okay, but if strict is set to true, that's when the user has to not be logged in. So now we need to check if that user is logged in or not. So we're going to say if there is a user, response is equal to false. So right there we're saying you don't need to be logged in, but that not logged in is strict, meaning you have to not be logged in. So if there is a user, that'll be when our response be false. Okay, so our next check, if our page config auth, so if that's true, we want to check if there's a user, but instead we want to say if there's not a user, response is equal to false. So that is pretty much all we should need to do for that. So let's just check again. So we're checking if the page doesn't need authentication, then we're checking if it needs to be strict. And if there is a user, we want to not give them access to it. If it does require authentication, check if there isn't a user logged in, don't let them in. Okay, let's just give that a quick look, shall we? So this is our home page, and we're coming up with an error. Why are we coming up with an error? Localhost unable to connect. Save. Okay, there we go. For some reason that was being silly. Localhost, and we're still being silly. What are we getting here? Okay, response is not defined on authentication check line 10. So authentication check line 10 response. Spell that incorrectly. Oh, I spelled that one incorrectly. Response. Alright. There we go. Apparently we don't have access, don't have permission to access this page, which is not right. And all not right, and we're throwing errors. So let's just refresh that and see what that error is. Now let's go home, and what is that error? Okay, cannot set headers after they sent. Okay, so that would be on this one right here. So we're saying if, okay, so what we've got right here is we're saying response.render error, and then we've got another response. So really we should have an else in there. And that's where that should sit, and that will fix up that error, but that's not going to fix up the you don't have permissions error. There we go. So we're not getting those errors, but we're still getting this one. So there is a problem with our if-else statement over here. Okay, so looking at it, I'm not actually returning anything. So return response. Let's try that again. All right, home. There we go. So home, we're able to go to register we are, login we are, dashboard, you do not have permission, log out, we do not have permission. Cool, now let's try to log in, basic@user.com, and basic. So now we're at the dashboard, can go home, can't go to register, can't go to login, can't go to dashboard, so that is working exactly how we wanted to. Okay, so the next step we want to do here was just making sure that, well, not making sure, we want to make sure these aren't visible when you are logged in, and these two aren't visible when you're not logged in. And that is all going to come down to our layout. So let's just hide all this to make it a bit easier. Layout, partials, and nav. So what we're going to do in here is we're going to create two more nav sections. All right, so let's say nav authenticated.ejs, and we also want to make a nav not non-authenticated. Cool. So we're going to throw those into there. So our register and our login will go into our non-authenticated, and our dashboard and our logout are going to go into our authenticated. Okay, we don't actually need those now. So let's add these in here. So we can use a little bit of our EJS. So we can say if there is a user, then we want to include nav authenticated, else we want to include our nav non-authenticated. And that should be it. So let's refresh this page. There we go. So we're not logged in at the moment, so we can only see register and login. So now let's log in, basic@user.com, and basic for the password. And there we go. Now we can only see our dashboard and our log out. But just in case somebody tries being a smartass and they try going and log in while they're here, it's going to throw an error, which is not what we want. All right. But that is fine. We'll deal with that another day. Alright, well, I actually had the video paused while I was trying to figure out that problem because it was annoying me. Alright, let's just go over it once more. Alright, so we'll log in basic@user.com, have our password basic, and let's say that we want to go to our login page, and it was coming up with that error. And it's only coming up with that error since we have added this. Okay? And the reason for that is it can't find user. The thing we have to remember is this right here is generated from our Express layouts. And our user is brought in through our user init function that we created. And if we have a look at our first page, we have our express layouts up here and our user init function down here. So what's happening is JavaScript is a scripting language. It's reading this and then it's trying to run this before it's actually created that user function. So what we need to do, what I'd like to do to make it clean is put all this above all this, and that would make it work. But that's not going to make these two work, especially because page config is wanting to use the user that Passport has done. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to put above all here for now until I find a bit more elegant solution and refactor it. And go app.use our user init, put it above our express layouts, and that fixes our problem. So we'll go refresh, go to log back in again, basic at user.com and basic. We try to go back to our login, and it works now. And the reason for that is because of that. Okay, as I said, well, I'll come up with a bit more elegant solution later. But yeah, for now, that works fine. All right, we'll leave it at that.